They loaded me up on the train down there in Anniston. Rode that train all the way out to San Diego. And they loaded me up on an old aircraft carrier, just loaded down with planes and more. Right there, Pearl Harbor on a ship. And that's where they took a load of them planes in there in Marshall Islands, right on the equator. Hot, no, 130 degrees all every day.
I was always aware of the mamas and the wives that their husbands was gone. They were sad, you know. My mom's brother was drafted. And I remember how disturbed she was that he was going off to war.
I can remember a lot of times you hear a car going by on the road, going by on the rims because he never had no tires. Everything was rationed, so there wasn't too much you could get, you know, as far as that, because it took everything for the war.
I can remember the sugar being rationed, and I believe the flour and stuff was rationed, because see, people raised their own corn, and they would take the corn to a grist mill and have their meal made. So they could have all of that they wanted, but I think sugar and flour and gas was rationed.
While it's important to know the big dates and events of our history, what we often miss are the stories and the memories of how those events affected people, families, and communities. These stories are what make up the rich, vast, and unfortunately fading fabric of America's oral history. We are currently losing members of the greatest generation at a rate of more than 600 a day. And with them, we are losing lifetimes of experiences and memories. It's a harsh truth that struck a personal chord with author Lacey Berry Post.
Growing up, I just loved listening to my grandparents talk about what life was like for them when they were young. I just became enamored with that time period. I loved hearing them talk about working in Anniston and the streets just being full of Fort McClellan soldiers on the weekends, and about my great-grandfather working at the fort, and about sugar rations. And I wanted my children and others to just read about, you know, what life was like back then and the sacrifices that, you know, that people made. And I wanted to preserve those stories and just be able to pass them along.
Inspired by the stories of her grandparents, Lacey wrote and published Songbird, a historical fiction novel set in Anniston, Alabama, and neighboring Fort McClellan during World War II. While the plot of the book is fiction, it is centered on true historic events that took place during the war era and how they affected the people living in the Anniston-Jacksonville area. Lacey was also able to incorporate many of her grandparents' stories into her work, ensuring their preservation for future generations.
Songbird is a fictional story, but it is based on true stories that I heard growing up from my grandparents. Ava, my principal character, she works in Anniston, Alabama, just like my grandmother did when she was young, and she also loves music and she performs for the Fort McClellan soldiers. My grandmother had a really good friend that was a performer, and she performed many times for the soldiers at Fort McClellan. Ava's brother Carson, he farms for the officers, and he becomes friends with some of the German POWs living there at the time. And that character is based on my great-grandfather, who worked at Fort McClellan during the war as a dispatcher and a farmer.
As Lacey researched for her book, she began to discover one amazing story after another, and not just in her family, but from all over the country. And so what began as a passion to retell her family's stories has now evolved into a full historic preservation movement. Songbird is now book one in a planned series of books entitled the War Song Series. On the warsongseries.com, not only will you find information about the books, but you can read about the history of the music featured in the series on the Follow the Music page. A historic preservation blog called War Stories is hosted on the site and features photos, videos, and articles retelling the history of the World War II era. Links can also be found to a Warsong Series Facebook page and Pinterest boards, all dedicated to documenting, preserving, and retelling the stories of our past. And the preservation page is full of resources and links to help anyone find out what they can do to preserve their own oral histories. Just as this passionate young woman was inspired by her grandparents, we too should be inspired by her passion to preserve the history around us. The National Trust for Historic Preservation has long recognized the importance and the need to preserve our oral histories. Not until recently, however, have the tools to do so been so readily available. We live in a time like no other, when the tools and equipment to record and retell our oral histories are literally at our fingertips. High-definition personal camcorders and even cell phones offer an easy and affordable solution for recording and retelling these stories. And with free resources like YouTube, WordPress, and Google to help us distribute these stories, we have the ability to preserve them not only for the next generation, but for all generations to come. To find out more about Lacey Berry Post and her story, or to discover ways you can create your own story, visit the preservation page at thewarsongseries.com.